right into things. I'm going to be checking my phone once in a while, not because I'm being rude, but because I want to keep an eye on our time and see how we're doing time-wise, because I have quite a bit packed in here. But I also put up a whole bunch of things into Google Classrooms because my sense with these workshops is y'all want to get the brain dump, and then you want to have concrete things you can take with you and use, modify, work with. So I put a whole bunch of my assignments up, and my slides are also available. So if there's links you want, they're going to be there. So hopefully that will be something of use when you walk out of here. I was asked to talk about, challenges and how to address them. And let me just say, first of all, that y'all have a really hard job. My daughter went through public education here in Texas. She was at Bryan ISD, and she had awesome teachers doing the great kind of work that you all are doing. And I know it's been a real challenge over the last year or so. And as a parent of a former public school student, I just want to say thank you all for doing the good work you're doing and for being here and trying to learn about how to make your students' experience even better. So thank you for that. And I know you all face a lot of challenges. If it makes you feel any better, the same challenges often show up in the college classroom. They seem to be perennial challenges with teaching writing. And it's always sort of a trick to figure out how to get the students engaged, how to get them thinking about writing, especially when you feel like you don't have a lot of tools in your toolbox. So that's what we're going to try to help with this week. Questions of what do I teach? Where are the resources? Cost of resources. I know a lot of you are in schools where there's not like extra money to go out and buy things, right? So how do you get these things to your students when you don't have budgets to go buy extra books or, have computers in the classroom and those kinds of things? How do you motivate the students, right? How do you get them engaged? Sometimes students just kind of are really, really passive or even hostile to teaching reading and writing, right? And how do I effectively teach these writing skills? What kinds of things can I do to make it move along, right? So let me first start off by talking about sort of my writing philosophy, which then will I'll walk you through some different approaches. I have always tried to teach a variety of genres, in part because I want to find genres that connect to the students where they're the authority. There's a real disconnect between students and, say, a Shakespeare play, right? Like they think this is so foreign, they don't know what this thing is. But if you can stair step them to those harder texts by giving them things they can talk about, music lyrics, for example, or interpreting videos, visuals, they feel a lot more confident with those that they're authorities. So you can walk them closer to that hard text. Along with that, I do a lot of stair-step writing. So short, informal writings, peer-to-peer assignments. I build research into components. So I'm not just saying, go find 20 texts and read them and then write a research paper and I'll see you next week, right? Like that's just not going to happen. Even in college, I can't do that. Even in my senior seminars with English majors, I still stair-step things. It makes it easier. Also things like multiple points of engagement, informal and formal writings, presentations, collaborative works, creative assignments. These are all things that I try to build in. And I think I'm going to talk about a lot of things I do, but then as we move through the week, you're going to get other examples as well. So let's start with genres, right? The TEKS talks about how important it is that students are able to listen, speak, read, write, and think using these multiple texts, right? So it's built into the TEKS. You're given permission to think about genres and not just the traditional genres of like short story, play, poem, right, novel. You can move beyond that. So this is an example of some of the texts that I teach in my Texas literature class. I teach some very classic literary texts like Sandra Cisneros or Gloria Anzaldúa, but then I also throw in some fun stuff, like we read some Molly Ivins or some Kinky Friedman. The Attica Locke book is a wonderful murder mystery that I teach. It talks about Black Houston, right? So I try to throw in some different things to kind of get them to read more broadly, to think more broadly, and to understand that there's lots of different texts that we can think about. Along with this, I also throw in some other stuff, like I teach corridos, right? Like when I teach poems, if I teach corridos along with those, I teach folk tales. I teach music, and you can see Friday Night Lights. I teach movies. I teach literature in 2 languages, right? Making sure students who don't have access to the Spanish have things in English, for example. I teach foodways. I teach things like commercials from Don't Mess with Texas. So I'm trying to build in a lot of variety. So the students that might be, say, resistance to a long novel, like I have a lot of students that struggle with Cormac McCarthy. They're like, it's too dense, it's too hard, but they feel perfectly comfortable with watching a video of a commercial about Don't Mess with Texas and saying, ah, yes, I could see these things in it. So we try to give them a broad variety. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of things that I do in terms of genres. And this material is all going to be available both through my slides and in the Google Classroom for you. So one of the really fun things I've experimented with that works really well is what I call my contemporary music assignment. And honestly, this could be done in a variety of classrooms, right? Because students really do have access to and understand lyrics. They will sit there and ponder them in ways that they will never ponder a poem, right? They'll see a poem as something that's outside, but music, that's something they listen to every day. So what I do is I say to them, okay, this is Texas Lit. I want you to find a song that talks about Texas or represents Texas. And I want you to think about that song as a lyric, right? Like both as music, lyrics, and sometimes they even bring visuals in from album covers or from music videos. And I have them write a blog post that analyzes this song. And I get amazing stuff. Students that write, like barely can write a paragraph on a poem, will like go on for paragraphs and paragraphs about this song that they've chosen and they're interested in. For the high school classroom, middle school classroom, you might want to have an approval process, right, for the songs. I even in college, students ask me, oh, this has some raunchy lyrics, and can I still use it? I said, yes, for the college classroom, you can, but you all might want to have a little check and balance in there, depending on, where you're at and what you're doing. But I give them a sample, right? And I show them how they can work with this material. And so they find the image, they put it online, they write about it. You could have this built into a Google Classroom, perhaps, so it's not public. You could have them put up links to music videos or YouTube, right? So they can share with their fellow students. They love to read each other's music blogs. They just love this. I built this in also with other sort of music to poetry. So we look at cowboy songs, the Texas Cowboy, for example. We listen to corridos. We look at folk tales. That's La Llorona, right? We pull these kind of materials in and then use it as a bridge to poetry that they're being asked to read, because then when they get to that poetry, it's easier for them. So we talk about, Tejano music. I do contemporary folk tales. So for example, this last YouTube is Cordo of Bernie Sanders that I found by a Texas group. And they love that. They find it funny, they find it interesting, and it shows them that there's the bridge between historical and contemporary works of art. The other thing I do that I think could be really powerful is a built environment presentation. Sorry, I have a cat tail there. A built environment presentation. And so around A&M's campuses, books, buildings, statues, the century tree, like all these things are in our environment. They have an understanding about them, but what if you actually analyze them as a text? So I have a built environment assignment where we actually, put them in groups. They go out and they look at this particular physical space or object. They come up with an analysis of it and present it to their classmates. You could do this in your hometown. Are there historical buildings in your town? Say a county courthouse. You could do it for your school. Like, is there a statue on campus? Is there a presentation or a display case on campus? There's lots of things you can do that helps them to think about what they look at every day, what they see every day, but then to analyze that as as something that they can be someone who has an authority on, right? They know about their high school statute. They know about that. They've heard about that since they came into high school. What happens if they're the authority? Can they do some research? Can they look at old yearbooks? Can they look at old newspapers? So these are things you can build in that gives them the authority, that are different genres that they're writing and presenting, which are two of the TEKS requirements that they're authorities on. All right, so let me sort of switch gears. I've thrown a bunch of stuff at you about genres. Let me talk about stair-stepping writing, because I think this is the most important thing you can do in your classroom. Because if you just go home and write an essay, what you get is, first of all, going to be really, really not great. Second of all, you have to grade that stuff. And grading bad writing is really hard. Grading good writing, much, much better, right? So how can you stair step things? The TEKS specifically talks about this idea of genres and literary analysis and rhetorical analysis, and actually creating your own, composing literary text. So you can use those in a stair step approach. And when I say stair step, you have multiple components to your writing. You often build small to large. You have peer-to-peer stuff, right? Like, I know you all are overwhelmed with grading, but what happens if you have peer-to-peer shared analysis? What happens when you do that? Where you can say, you did your peer-to-peer thing, I give you credit for that. You don't have to go in and grade it closely, but they've gotten that experience of looking at each other's writing. Now, I have some suggestions for that, because if you just put them in a small group and say, read each other's writing and answer 2 questions, sometimes you don't get the best results. So I have some other suggestions for that as well. When I say multiple components, this is kind of what my syllabus looks like, to show you how much I break down assignments, right? So you can see the class assignments at the top. They have, a course project, which is 50% of their grade. That's a huge percent of their grade. When students see that, they're going to freak out, because that means one thing is 50%. But what I tell them is, no, keep going. If you look toward the bottom of the slide, what you see is I have actually 4 different assignments that make up that 50%, right? So it's a much smaller set of items that they can work their ways through. And some of them, like the research analysis, it's a give me. You do it, you engage with this, you get a full grade. So I try to build in sort of low stakes and high stakes things as well. Things that if you just do, you get credit for. Whereas a research paper, that's, something you want to have as a pretty well-developed item. All right. So small to large. So with the archive assignments, I'll do things like, we have an archive assignment. We go into the A&M archives. You write a blog post on what you experienced there, right? So it's just experiential. I went to the archives. Here's a cool thing I found. And then you work your way up to a short research paper, okay? So small to large. And here's the archive assignment. This is a typical low stakes assignment I like to give my students. You engage with this thing I ask you to. You thought about it. What kinds of things, did you find? Write a well-developed paragraph about this and give it to me. So they get feedback. I'll tell them, make sure you have a clear topic sentence, right? But they also get just a little experience of writing in a way that makes sense to them before we get to some of these harder things. Okay, so stair stepping in this way is really important. I mentioned peer-to-peer things that I do. One is class responses. I like to make students the authority. So say you have a set of text, say you have a set of poetry you're reading, or you're doing some song lyrics. I often would ask students to put together sort of a short response and on that assignment. So if I've assigned, say, a poem for 19th century American literature, I'll tell them, you sign up for one of these, and I want you to think about writing a paragraph that talks about the highlights of that text. Find a support item, a map, a picture, a song. Usually they'll be like, here's a picture of the author, right? And then maybe 3 questions that get us thinking about that text, and then they post it and come to class, and I might refer to them in class discussion. They don't lead the class discussion. I don't want to put that pressure even on college students, but they engage. Now for the high school classroom, what you could do is say, you're assigned this text. I want you to just do 3 questions that you post to Google Classroom and know that material. So once in a while I might call on you to kind of add your expert opinion, right? So there's ways to kind of make this even smaller, more contained, but by making a student in charge of a text you're reading, you're asking them to sort of think ahead of time and to be prepared and to engage with this in a way that's going to be more robust, right? And for this one, I'm pretty generous. If you do this, you're engaged, it's a decent paragraph, I'm going to give you a strong grade on this, right? Because you've done the work I've asked you to do. All right. Another thing I've tried, and this is a very COVID-y friendly assignment. When we were kicked out of the classrooms last spring, I was like, oh my gosh, we're dealing with all this material. How am I going to recreate a classroom discussion? Because now we're all sitting in Zoom all over Texas, all over the world for some of my students. How am I going to do this? So I started using a software called Hypothesis. And it's a free software, so they wouldn't have to say anything, pay anything. It gets attached to Chrome, and it allows for both close readings of the text and conversations between students. Now, whether this is successful for you or not will depend how much access students have to computers both in and out of the classroom, right? So like I know in my daughter's high school, certain classes this would work for, and other classes it wouldn't. Like in middle school, I remember that she had students who didn't even have a phone. So how could you do this, right? You couldn't assign that. So think about your student body. But if you think that you can put them maybe in small groups that they can cluster around a computer, or if this will work on phones and you have enough students with phones, then this could really work for you. This is a screenshot of what it looks like. Students can highlight a section of the text and then they write a comment on the side. So usually for this, I would say you have a poem. I want each of you before class starts to write a comment on a section of this poem. And it can be a question. It can be a definition, as you see here. Somebody didn't know the word, so they went and looked it up. Somebody says, I had no idea what this word meant. I had no idea it had anything to do with music, but then I thought about it, and here's the kinds of things that seemed important to me, right? And I give them a prompt like, think about the rhythm of a blues piece. Try to read it out loud. What do you hear? So what I would do is have students do this before class and then use their comments as a jumping point for discussion. And because they had already thought about it, they tended to be more vocal. They tended to engage and be like, yeah, I saw that in the text. I was confused too, but here's what I looked up. So this annotation assignment works really, really well. It's one of the best things I've come up with in the last few years. And the fact that it's free and easy to use is a plus. All right. I want to make sure I have time. I'm looking, we've got about 8 more minutes, 8 to 10 minutes. So we're good. This was something that I even saw as I entered into the discussion this morning. As I came online to Zoom, I saw some of you saying, I want to learn about the MSA. This was a idea that I saw several of my colleagues around the country talking about a few years ago. And I thought, wait, well, this is interesting. This could really work. I've always done sort of project-based learning. And notice too, again, that the TEKS allows for this. They say that students can compose informational text such as explanatory essays or personal essays. So this is really something that you can do in the classroom that gives your students some options. So I was trying to think about ways that students could do something creative rather than just write that big final research paper, because even in the college classroom, they struggle with this. My Texas Lit class, for example, is a 300 level class, but it tends to be all non-English majors. And, I get a wide variety of majors. I've got engineers who've never taken a Lit class since they left high school. I've got business people. I've got accounting people. I mean, I have this huge variety of students, and a lot of them aren't even humanities. They're not history. They're not literature. So when I would assign a big final essay, it wouldn't go well because students like in engineering, they haven't written a large essay since high school. They don't quite know what a college essay requires. So I thought, I've got to give them some other options because this is not working. So it's Texas Lit. I showed you all those genres we do, foodways. We talk about, the taco tension in Texas, right? The fight over brisket in Texas. We talk about A&M barbecue camp and how that works and the traditions of Black foodways, like the new high on the hog video that just came out recently on Black foodways. There's a whole episode on Texas. I'm like, I'm going to show that because it talks about Texas barbecue. So these are ways to engage them with alternative narrative. They're all narratives. These are stories we tell about Texas. So that fits under the literary rubric, right? So I thought, how do I bring that into the final assignment? So what I've discovered is the unessay, which allows them to write a traditional essay should they want to. They can still keep that as an option. And some of my English majors are like, look, I've got that down. I'm going to write an essay. I got that. Others who are a little more unclear about what an essay should be, will make a creative essay or a creative project. So here's some examples of projects. I had students really get into the foodways stuff. So you can see I have a student that did a modern South Texas border cookbook. She did both. She did this Spanglish version of it. It was really great. She took some of her family food traditions and her family recipes and wrote them in Spanglish and talked about how this language crossed the border, right? You can see a student from El Paso made those tacos down in the corner. It was a family recipe and he brought everybody snacks. And who doesn't like snacks, right? I have students do art projects. And so what this is I call it an unessay. And I say it's a creative way to engage with topics we've talked about in the course. And in Texas Lit, they have a set of topics. In American Lit, they have a set of topics. They know what we've kept, what we've talked about all semester. Sort of, I always do, here are the big picture narratives or ideas I want you to understand. So in Texas, it might be how we make meaning of Texas. Like, what are some of the traditional ways we think about Texas? Like, why is the Alamo showing up over and over and over again in Texas literature, in Texas imagery, right? You could think the same way about this in American literature. When I teach American literature, I say, what are some of the big narratives? We talk about nationhood, we talk about landscape, right? So they know these big pictures. And I say, you've had these big picture thoughts, discussions, and readings. Now, choose your own topic. Think about how you want to present that. It can be in any way. I'm going to evaluate you on how compelling and effective that is. And then this is the most important part. They don't just turn in a painting. They don't just turn in a cookbook. You need to write a critical reflection on the ideas of this. So this is Texas literature, right? So write a reflection on how your project fits with Texas literature. If I'm teaching American literature, write a short paper that reflects on how your essay connects with some of the major ideas we've talked about. You can use sources or not, it's up to you. So I give them some examples of previous projects. I bring things in, I point them to other kinds of projects. So, a video that explores the idea of Texas landscape. So I had a student who talked about her family's deer ranch and how that connects with the ideas of Texas landscape historically and in some of the literature we had read. A song that you write. I had a student do a song for us. He wrote a song, came in and played it, and it was really cool. A sewing project, a knitting project. I had a student that made a quilt with her grandmother, and she talked about that tradition and some of the motifs she put on it and how they connected to some of the literature we had read. Food, multimedia projects, social media projects. I've had a lot of students who get really into the idea of I can create a music list on Spotify, and then I'm going to tell you why I put these materials together, right? So why I put these songs together, why this is important, why these sets of songs represent the borderlands of El Paso or whatever, right? But again, the most important thing is not only do they conceptualize it, but they can write about it. So, you're not losing the written part if you go down the unessay path. You're just giving them a way to speak as an authority about the object or the item they produce. I have included these slides in your Google Classroom so you can look at some of these examples. I always give them examples. And here's the prompt I use for the unessay written response. It should be a 1 to 2 page written document that explains the thinking behind the project. It's a personal reflection. It's a place to talk about what the project's considering. And I encourage them to reference things we've read or talked about during the semester. And also I say, talk about what works or doesn't work. Sometimes you try a project and it blows up. You tried to do interviews with 10 of your family members to talk about, I had a student who did interviews with his family to talk about Chicano family traditions in South Texas. And he could only get to like 5 rather than the 10. So he talked about that, right? Like, and I was like, great, you still got 5. Look what you've recorded. So if something fails or doesn't go quite the way they wanted to, that's okay. It's not an automatic fail for the project, because sometimes they try these huge things and they don't work. But you get to talk about that, what worked or what didn't, and reflect on it. And so it's really a nice way for them to become authorities, and it makes their writing much stronger because they actually care about these ideas that they're communicating. Now you're going to ask me about grading. Here's one response to grading. I've included more in the Google Classroom, but you could break this down and sort of talk about sections of argument. A good essay synthesizes and analyzes. So what you want to do is make sure that they can take the idea of, say, Texas tacos, and then sort of think through that, what that means. It talks about the variety of cultural groups that make up Texas. It talks about regions of Texas, right? That they can, instead of just saying Texas tacos are important to Texas, done, right? That they can then take that the next step further. Maybe talk about, on the days we talked about foodways, we looked at puffy tacos versus, Dallas style, tortillas, right? Or whatever. So they need to be able to synthesize and analyze. And they need to be able to show it's crafted, that they didn't just throw this together at the last minute. So these are some of the criteria that I use. I think this will work nicely turning into a rubric, which would probably be better for the K through 12 classroom, right? That they can see, here are the clearly defined items you're looking for. And when I do this, I weigh heavily the written component, and I tell them, you can have a fabulous creative project, but if you don't do a good job in the written part of this, that I can't understand how this quilt has anything to do with what we've talked about this semester, then your unessay has failed. Even if the painting is not, high quality art. Some of them are worried about this. I'm like, I'm not grading you as an art major. I'm grading you as someone who can conceptualize ideas and then write about them. So this written component is really important. So you might, as you're thinking about making a grading rubric, break that out so that shows it's important. So those are some of the ideas I have for you. I've thrown a lot at you. I'm looking at my time, on time, good. So I've thrown a lot of things at you. Let me stop sharing my screen for the moment. And because I really wanted you to see just the variety of things that I've tried in the classroom. What I really want you to understand is you can be experimental with this material, that you can try different things. It's okay if the thing you tried didn't quite work, you can revise it or you can dump it, right? So don't be afraid to experiment, because the only way we're going to get better at teaching writing is to try different things and to see where they take us. Some classrooms you're going to run into problems you never thought about. Like, I'm sure the teachers that assign my daughter in middle school, like, go home and write, slides on Google PowerPoint or Google Slides, write a group presentation and come back and we'll look at your slides together. I'm sure they didn't think about the fact that a lot of students didn't have access to computers at home. So what happened was, all the kids in my daughter's group called her, told her what to put in the doc, because she had access to a computer. So that was how the students got around it. But I'm sure the teacher didn't think about it. They wouldn't give them an assignment, that they couldn't do, right? So try things, see where you run up against resistances, and then take those moments to revise them the next time you teach them, because it's really an iteration. It's not going to be perfect when you work with experimental things, but your alternative is to keep doing the same old, where when you get that paper in, it's just not very good. And then you have to grade it. This is what I always tell teachers. It's painful to grade bad writing, but these kinds of assignments, grading music blog posts, that is the most wonderful assignment to grade, because I get to learn about the kinds of music students are engaged with, the kinds of ideas they're interested in. And then when I come back to the classroom, we can have more interesting conversations, because I'm like, some of you are really into Randy Travis. Who would have thought? Like, I had no idea. Or, so-and-so mentioned his buddy's band, which played in Denton last week. Let's talk about, this really cool song. So you get to learn about your students through writing and through these projects in ways they may not reveal in class as well. So I think that's all I want to say. I'm looking at my time. I am in good shape.